and thank you for coming to tonight's event presented by the Federalist Society here at Vermont Law School. Tonight's format is going to be slightly altered than our traditional Federalist Society events. We were unable to secure a second speaker after much effort of trying, or much effort of asking people and such. So tonight, what will happen is Professor McCormack will introduce our speaker and the topic, and then Ms. Hoff Sommers will speak for about 30 minutes. Professor McCormack will then ask a few questions, and after that point in time, we'll start doing audience questions. If you would write your questions on note cards, then the various Federalist Society members will stand up and collect those note cards, and we'll go from there. Assisting us in tonight's panel is Professor Beth McCormack. She joined the VLS faculty in 2011, and prior to joining Vermont Law School, she practiced in the litigation section of the Boston law firm Mintz, Levin, Cohn, Ferris, Filofsky, and Popio, PC. She has extensive experience in commercial litigation with a focus in construction law. She was a member of the firm's hiring committee and served as a mentor to new associates. In addition, she was instructor at Boston University School of Law, where she taught legal research and writing to first-year law students. In 2007, Professor McCormack served as Special Assistant District Attorney at the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, where she took more than 20 criminal cases to trial. She is admitted to practice in Massachusetts before the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts and the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Professor McCormack received her AB from the University of Chicago and her JD cum laude from Boston University School of Law, where she was a member of the Public Interest Law Journal, and she participated in the Stone Moot Court Competition, the Averse Honors Moot Court Competition, and was a member of the Craven National Moot Court team. Please join me in welcoming Professor McCormack.
Thank you to the Federalist Society for putting this event together tonight. Tonight we hope to discuss the interplay of feminism and conservative ideology. In particular, we hope to discuss questions such as whether modern feminism hurts or helps today's women, whether women are actually better off or at least in the same position as their male counterparts in schools and in the workforce, and whether one can actually be a feminist and a conservative at the same time. To help us tackle these and other issues, we are lucky to have with us Ms. Christina Hoff Sommers. Ms. Hoff Sommers is an author and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. She's a former philosophy professor from Clark University. She is well known for her critique of late 20th century feminism, and she is also well known for her extensive and sometimes controversial writings, including Who Stole Feminism, How Women Have Betrayed Women, The War Against Boys, and One Nation Under Therapy. Ms. Hoff Sommers holds a BA from NYU and a PhD in philosophy from Brandeis. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Hoff Sommers to Vermont Law School.
I'm not checking my email. I'm going to time myself to make sure I limit this to exactly 30 minutes, no more, and then can't I just take questions? Do they have to write them?
That'd be fine.
Yeah.
Which one?
You can just say questions if you desire.
It just seems more natural. Okay. Well, I am Christina Hoff Sommers from the American Enterprise Institute, former philosophy professor, as you heard. And until the early 90s, I was a feminist scholar in good standing. I was invited, my courses in philosophy were cross-listed with women's studies. Philosophy journals, feminist philosophy journals had me evaluate articles for publication. I was invited to women's conferences. That all changed when I published a book called Who Stole Feminism. Now, I felt that the book was strongly feminist. I am a firm advocate of what I call equity feminism. An equity feminist wants for women what she wants for everyone: fair treatment, dignity, freedom. But I took issue with the idea that American women were an oppressed class. And I also had a lot to say about the eccentricity of some of my feminist colleagues. The chair of my department had asked me to teach a course in feminist theory, and the textbooks arrived. And one of the first things I noticed was one of them was dedicated to the women in my women's studies ovular in the spring of '89. And I hadn't seen the word ovular before, and I was about to go to the dictionary, and then I realized She'd made it up. She didn't like the word seminar, with its root word associated with the very essence of male power. So she changed it to ovular. Now, it was funny, but she wasn't kidding. So I was sort of making fun of the eccentricities and taking exception to some of the kind of hard-line, occasionally even Marxist analysis of American society, calling us a patriarchal, oppressive society. That's not what I saw. I mean, in my own classrooms, there were increasingly, as on most college campuses, more young women than young men. And the young women I saw had the highest aspirations. I mean, in many ways, they were among the freest, most liberated people, women, in the world and historically. And to tell, in these women's studies textbooks that I collected, to tell young women that they were oppressed and held down by patriarchy seemed over the top, unnecessary. We had moved on. Maybe it was true in the 1970s. I was part of that. But it seemed to me that the movement was not changing with the times. Now, when I wrote the book, I got some fan letters from feminist colleagues, but for the most part, my critique was not appreciated. And I was subject to a colorful array of descriptions. Well, I remember I was called a backlasher, a traitor to my gender, anti-woman, on one occasion even a non-woman. Someone referred to Christina Hoff Sommers and Margaret Thatcher, those two female impersonators. Now, I'll tell you, this was not always easy for my mom and dad, who they're very liberal. They're kind of mortified that their daughters admired by people they revile and has fans. On my dad, I lost him recently, but he used to listen to Rush Limbaugh just to get his blood pressure up. And my mother would say, "Turn it off, it upsets you." As soon as he'd get out of the car, he'd turn on Rush and get furious. And on one occasion, Mr. Limbaugh said, "Oh, I've just seen this book," and he hadn't really read it, but he said, "I've just seen this book, Christina Hoff Sommers, Who Stole Feminism. I think, this is a good book." My dad almost loses it. But whatever he remained a loyal fan to the end, and whenever I published anything, he'd run out and get it. And on one occasion, Playboy magazine had a little piece about my book, and my dad wanted to get a copy. But at the time, he was living in Northfield, Massachusetts, a tiny town, and he was a little embarrassed to go and buy Playboy at the local store, where everybody knew him, this 87-year-old guy turning up. So he crossed the border into the more libertine Keene, New Hampshire, and went to the store and said, but even then he felt he had to explain himself to the salesman. So he said, "I'm only buying this because my daughter's in it." Anyway, he just paid and fled. I am not a backlasher. I hope I'm not a traitor to my gender. I feel that I am a passionate feminist of the more traditional, enlightened, egalitarian variety. And I truly believe women will be better served if we find our way back to a more traditional feminism. A feminism that's more inclusive, that doesn't have all these litmus tests, because I will tell you today, if you ask a group of women and men, anybody, "Are you a feminist?" almost no one says yes. A tiny coterie of women are strongly identified, but for the most part, nearly 2/3 reject the label. The Daily Beast did a poll and found that 17% of women, only 17% of women, said they would want their daughters to identify as feminists. And then lately I've been seeing an array of modern women as diverse as Taylor Swift, Sandra Day O'Connor, Beyonce, Lady Gaga, objecting to the designation. They say, "No, I'm not a feminist. It means being angry and querulous." Lady Gaga said, "It means hating men. I love men." Even Yahoo CEO Marissa Mayer rejected this label. Now, why would that be? I mean, after all, the emancipation of women is one of the glories of Western civilization. I mean, women organized, fought for, and won the right, not just the right to vote, That was the first wave, but increasingly, full equality before the law, the freedom to pursue an education, to enter any occupation, and the establishment of special protections against discrimination and harassment. I mean, these deeds, some of them many of them within living memory, are, in my opinion, they profoundly improved society, our economy. I mean, feminism is one of the great chapters in the history of freedom. Why is the term that describes that heritage in such disrepute? Now, if you ask someone like Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women, she claims that feminists have been unfairly portrayed as unhappy, angry, and humorless. And these stereotypes, she says, have estranged the younger generation. But my question is, are these stereotypes completely unfounded? I mean, just consider for a moment the famous playwright Eve Ensler, who wrote the Vagina Monologues. I'm going to say something critical about her now, I'll say something nice later. So. I mean, I don't want to be harsh, but I attended a lecture by Ms. Ensler at the Radcliffe Institute in 2003, and she told an audience of audience of brilliant young women that American women, in their way, were just as oppressed as women in societies like Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are societies that practice forced veiling and impose arranged marriages and where women can be sentenced to death for adultery. And she said, quote, "I think that the oppression of women is universal. We are bonded in every single place in the world. I think the conditions are exactly," that was her emphasis, "exactly the same. The systemic global oppression of women is complete across the globe." Now, the African-American feminist Bell Hooks, she's a distinguished professor of English at City College, she has criticized theories like Ensler's of common oppression. She says they ignore critical differences between the lives of poor women, women of color, and privileged college-educated women, and I think she's right about that. But then Ms. Hooks turns around and makes sweeping pronouncements that are as radical or perhaps more than those of Ensler's. She's contrived a radical theory of oppression that I think is totally removed from reality. She says, for example, as long as the United States is an imperialistic, capitalist, patriarchal society, so a large female majority can, then no female majority can ever enter the ranks of the powerful. And she gratefully quotes the French feminist Antoine Fouquet, who calls for the overthrow of the phallic masculine economy. Now, fair or not, feminism in the public mind is associated with these hardliners. I mean, most American women, including those who are strongly committed to equality, just don't think of themselves as being enthralled to a mass delusion or held down by some systemic system, some global oppression. And Asian women, Latino women, black women, white women, they want their rights. But Hooks, when she calls to bring down the ruling capitalist patriarchy, I mean, that's just going to be off-putting to most people. So to identify oneself as a feminist these days is to claim association with a kind of dire worldview. So women of all colors, and certainly African-American women and working-class women, they keep their distance. As for men, most of them have just run for cover. Now, some will say, and they say this to me, well, look, if you think that feminism has basically achieved its goals, then maybe it's time to let it fade from the scene. Because I will tell you, I do not think that, I think there is still work to be done, and I'll talk about that momentarily. But I do think the major battles are over. I think that feminism is the great American success story. And we've all benefited immensely. And there are still problems. Women still have problems in this society, but so do men. And we don't have a big men's lobby that's constantly churning out studies to show how oppressed men are, and I'm not calling for those. But on the other hand, we have a huge problem, which is that we have a women's lobby that developed for good reason, and I was a part of it in my own small way in the 70s. We built up just a network of women's lobby in every municipality, in every state, nationally, in Washington where I live. And they came into being, as I said, for good reason in the 1970s. But the tendency for an organization is not to say in 1999, 2000, well, our work is done, let's close up shop. They don't do that. They're more and more invested, and I believe that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, they're knocking down doors that are already open. And they're ignoring problems, serious social problems, because of their ideology. They tend to see the world as a battle between Venus and Mars, and it's their job to defend Venus. Whereas for most American women, we realize that we're not competing with men. We're all in this together. These are our sons, our brothers, our lovers, our friends. If they're in trouble, so are we all. And I just don't, I don't see that in the contemporary women's movement. I won't talk about it a lot unless you ask about it in discussion, but in my book, The War Against Boys, if you look at what's happening to young men, especially working class young men and young men of color, it is, right now, sociologists, and I will say around Washington, D.C., at the think tanks, they can't believe what they're seeing, is the young women are on a trajectory in education, higher aspirations, and young men are either standing still or going down. And we have a large and growing cohort of boys who are not going to find a place for themselves in a knowledge-based economy. And in England, Canada, Australia, most of the English-speaking world, they do have a problem with boys. The British call it laddism, and they're desperately, at the highest levels of government, they're trying to solve what they call the boy gap. Massive literacy programs and experiments with single-sex classes and boy-friendly practices and so forth. We are doing none of that. And the women's lobby tends to see it as part of a backlash, and they very much stand in the way of it. So what I see is that it's we needed this lobby, and now it's a little out of control, and men have no one representing them. So, for example, you could say it's a man's world. Well, it's not a little boy's world. And it's very hard to do anything to help young men right now with their problems in school and their problems in the economy, as the manufacturing base has eroded and jobs in construction and so forth have gone down, and we've moved to an information-based economy. It's very hard to make it into the middle class without education beyond high school. And far more women are getting it, and huge numbers of young men are not. They have not got them. They have not understood, or they don't care. I can't figure it out, and no one can. It's a huge problem, but that's why I say men have their problems, women have theirs. But if I look at American society, I see a mix of blessings and burdens for each sex. But why I still think we need feminism is basically three reasons. First of all, we did liberate ourselves in ways which are vital to a liberal society, and I think we have to honor that tradition, understand it, study it, know what went on. Freedom in all its forms requires vigilance. So we need to understand how the women's movement succeeded in order to protect it and preserve it. Secondly, maybe this is my most important point, but probably not one I'll have time to talk about too much tonight. Most of the women in the world have not had two major waves of liberation. Some of them haven't had so much as a ripple. And across the globe, there are fledgling women's groups struggling to survive and improve their societies. And they're facing opposition beyond anything we faced in the West. I mean, they're threatened with imprisonment, and then they're threatened with, in some cases, in Iran, with floggings and torture. The leaders of these women's groups are asking for our assistance. Every year, for a few years, I've been going to international women's conferences. And there are these women that are from Burma and from Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Libya, and they are the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony of their societies. And they are asking for our help. And where is that help? There are pockets of it. Americans are enormously philanthropic, and there are lots of development programs. But if you think of what American students did, for example, in the 1970s with the apartheid in South Africa, it was a major movement to dismantle racial apartheid in South Africa. Where are the movements to dismantle gender apartheid in the developing world? Where are the student? I mean, why are as a global village, and we have a way of knowing what's going on in Egypt right now, and worst of all, Iran, which is a kind of 1984 for women. I just don't see that kind of sisterhood, and so I think that it is my view that just as fighting slavery was the great moral challenge in the 19th century, totalitarianism in the 20th century, I think the liberation of women around the world is the great moral challenge of the 21st century. And I'm waiting for us to get started. So I think we need a women's movement for that purpose as well. And finally, I believe we need feminism because even in the West, the movement is not over. I mean, women far more than men struggle with the challenge of combining work and family. We still have a popular culture where there are strong elements of misogyny. And although violence against women appears to be diminishing, it continues to exact a terrible toll. These problems are intractable, they're abiding, and I think the negotiation of the social and sexual relations between the sexes is a constant feature of human existence, and the unique circumstances of women require special attention and protections. So who needs feminism? We do, the world does. But an effective women's movement has to be rescued from its current outcast state. Feminism needs to become expansive, hospitable, and that means it has to appeal to the great majority of women who are not radical, who don't think in terms of dismantling of the capitalist male hegemony, but who are moderate and customary, rather than radical. And in my view, I've just written this little book defending what I call freedom feminism, and I think that's the answer. And it's kind of an amalgam, a combination of what I think was the best in even hardline feminism. I think there were some good things that we learned from that movement, called radical feminism. But also, I've resurrected the lost history of conservative feminism. Because in the 18th century and the 19th century, there were always two paths that led to women's emancipation. There was your Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was one of the great women in the feminist pantheon. There was also a woman named Hannah More, who was much more traditional and conventional, but and much more popular than Mary Wollstonecraft. And she and Mary ended up leading to the same point. What Hannah More wanted to do was she believed in women's education. But she had a strong sense, she believed in female empowerment. She believed that women were the caretakers of the nation. And she thought that they had to get out of their homes and into the society. She had a vision of domestic heroism. And she wrote novels and pamphlets, and traditional, religious, conventional women would read Hannah More, and it changed their lives. And they would go out of the homes, into the public sphere, in philanthropic pursuits, working in hospitals and orphanages and so forth. And this had a liberating effect, because once women are out of the home and together in making common cause for a social purpose, it raises their consciousness. And they tend to that led to more and more women demanding the vote, because once they were out in society and they saw the problems, they wanted to make a difference. Same thing happened in the suffrage movement in this country. You've all heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They were what I would call the more radical egalitarian feminists, and I use that relatively, they weren't radicals in the sense of today, but they appealed to kind of abstract principles of justice, and for many, many years, it fell on deaf ears. And over and over again, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were just so depressed, they weren't succeeding. Well, along comes a woman named Frances Willard, and she's president of the Christian Temperance Union, and today we associate that with, of course, prohibition, and it seems old-fashioned and so forth, but under her leadership, prohibition was a movement not just to stop people from drinking, but alcohol was seen as a threat. The saloon was the threat to the home. And women were facing not only the horrors of drunkenness in their husbands and loss of family funds and so forth, but so that it was thought that if we could control alcohol, we could control men, drunken men. And all of the feminists were subscribed to temperance, including Susan B. Anthony. But what Frances Willard did is she tailored her message to conventional religious women who were not radical, who were not, didn't want to do anything that would upset their families or their husbands. But she gave them projects and she gave them activities, and she turned this. It was much more than temperance. It was a kind of social awareness and philanthropic movement. And just like Hannah More, she brought she appealed to the majority of women. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the more radical of the two, was never comfortable with Frances Willard. Susan B. Anthony loved her because she brought them something they weren't acquainted with, victories. And as soon as Frances Willard would go somewhere and tell women, you have to vote because you have to defend your homes. She called it the family protection ballot. And it worked. It wasn't, there were many, many other forces that led to women winning the suffrage, but I don't think there's any historian that could not credit Frances Willard with turning suffrage into a mainstream movement. Now, what I'm trying to do today is to bring back those two paths. We need the radicals, there's a place for them, but we need that conservative force. We need those two paths. And we don't have it. In fact, I don't even think we have one path, because I think that the hardliners, I call them, or I'll explain in a minute more what I mean, are just not inclusive. Most women are not welcome at the table unless you can pass 16 tests of ideological purity. And there's no history of success. There's some history in being bold and breaking down walls and being iconoclast. But to have a mainstream movement, you need more than iconoclasm, and you need to move on. And that's why I say you can't just keep knocking down doors that are open. You have to move on and, as I said, become more welcoming. Now, as a freedom feminist, I do not think, as I said, that American women are part of a massive system of worldwide oppression. We are a nation that, for the most part, has realized the aspirations of our feminist foremothers beyond their wildest dreams. And where I part with my colleagues in feminist philosophy, or what I would call today's organized women's movement, I believe in freedom feminism, or what I've called equity feminism. And I think my colleagues, if I could organize their thinking, I'll probably do some injustice to some of them, but I call it gender feminism, or victim feminism. And a gender feminism, I took that term from a philosopher named Sandra Lee Bartke. She deploys the notion of a sex-gender system. And the idea is that oppression is systemic, that every institution bears the impress of patriarchy, and nothing less than a radical restructuring and reorganization of society can succeed. She wants to find a sex-gender system, or the sex-gender system is that system whereby bisexual infants were transformed into male and female gendered personalities, one destined to command, the other to obey. I read that definition to my husband, and he said, which one commands and which obeys? But never mind. So a sex-gender feminist, as I said, they tend to think in, and rather radical terms politically, tend to be pretty left-wing, and have a fairly negative evaluation of where we are in this country, which I just, as a philosophy professor who likes to, rules of evidence, what is the evidence? What would count as success when you see the ascendancy of women in American society? Now, there are 2 or 3 very serious problems with gender feminism. The first one, misinformation. If you pick up almost any women's studies textbook, or visit a college women's center, or look at a syllabus of a typical feminist theory class, you're likely to find sort of elaborate conspiracy theories about the male hegemony. American college women may be among the freest and most fortunate people in the world, but in Women's Studies 101, they're taught that they inhabit an oppressive society where women are conditioned to subordination, routinely battered and raped by men and channeled into low-paying fields, cheated out of almost a quarter of their income. Now, there are serious scholars in women's studies, and this book I've written on conservative feminism, I am so indebted to so many brilliant women scholars, historians. But there are 2 kinds of women scholars. There are those that are just doing straightforward scholarship and abiding by the traditional sort of rules of their discipline. And then there are the kind of feminist ideologues who are kind of inflamed and more, their classes are more political than scholarly. So it's the ideological, and they are, I will also say they are, some of them are statistically challenged. And these include if I were to give some divisions, there are some die-hard egalitarians, especially in the women's movement in Washington, D.C., in the women's lobby. They're still in the thrall to this 1970s idea that they dream of this gender-neutral society, where if we could just get little girls to play with trucks and little boys to play with dolls, and we could mesh the sexes, we would have a kind of gender utopia. It hasn't worked. If anything, there's evidence that, children don't cooperate with this, for one thing. And later I'll tell you what they're trying to do in Sweden and what has happened. So you have some hardline egalitarians in the women's studies. There are also difference feminists who view women as different but far better than men. And then there are assorted Marxists and post-colonialists and ecofeminists. And one thing they share is they seem to have a need for data that depicts American society as ruinous for women. And over the years, I have carefully looked at feminist claims about women in violence, women in depression, eating disorders, pay equity, education. What I have found is that almost all, not every single statistic, but most of them that you find in these women's studies textbooks are misleading, confused, sometimes deliberately inaccurate. Well, I don't want to say deliberately. I don't think people do this deliberately. I don't know why they do it. I don't know what it is. I'll give you an example. There's a professor of law, Nancy Lemon at Berkeley, and she's written the leading textbook, Domestic Violence Law. And I went through her book and found a lot of mistakes. And right at the beginning, she says that the laws about violence against women originated in 700 BC under the rule of King Romulus of Rome, and he promulgated a law that a man could beat his wife as long as the implement of punishment was no thicker than his thumb. And this is where the phrase rule of thumb originated. Okay, problem number 1. Romulus is a mythic figure, didn't exist. He was the son of Mars nursed by a wolf. And I told her that. And the rule of thumb is a myth. Just Google, rule of thumb, urban legend. And even most feminist scholars have given up on this. No one has ever been able to find that law. People have referred to it, but no one can find such a law. And there is no linguist who thinks that the phrase rule of thumb comes from this rule. It's just a myth, a hoax. I told her that. Her book also says that domestic violence is the leading cause of birth defects, or she has a version of this claim that it's the leading cause of birth defects according to the March of Dimes. Well, if you call the March of Dimes, which I've done several times because we've made common cause, they will always tell me, we can't stop it, it's not true, we did no such study, but it's out there, it's in the media echo chamber, it's in the feminist literature, we can't seem to stop it. A colorful bit of misinformation in the 90s was that on Super Bowl Sunday, battery increases 40%. And men were warned, NBC ran a public service announcement during the Super Bowl, urging men to remain calm during the game. Well, this reporter, this wonderful guy at the Washington Post, Ken Rengel, I think he's now retired, he did something very unusual when it comes to a feminist victim statistic. He checked the facts. It took him about an hour to find out there was no source. Someone had misquoted someone, and it was like a game of telephone tag, but there it was. And it can't be corrected. Back to Nancy Lemon, she also said that, in her book, she said that something like 20 to 30% of women in emergency rooms are there because of domestic violence. And if you call the CDC or look at Bureau of Justice statistics, you find that it's actually fewer than 1%. It's not to say it's not a horrible problem. In fact, it's because I think domestic violence is such a heinous problem that women deserve good research, accurate statistics, and smart policies. And so I fail to see how misinformation and exaggeration helps women. I mean, someone convince me of that, but I see too many instances of crying wolf and misrepresentation. Now that's just one example, or a few examples. Just one other, there's a book called The Penguin Atlas on Women, edited by Nancy, to finish my story about Nancy Lemon, I wrote to her and told her, and gave her all the sources and said, forget it about Romulus of Rome and his rule of thumb, it didn't happen. And if you call the March of Dimes, they deny they did this study. And if you call the CDC, they will tell you that it's simply not the case, that the majority of women, or not majority, but she said up to almost 30% of women in emergency rooms are there because they were beaten up by their boyfriends or husbands. She wrote back and said, no, I've checked these things out and they're fine. And she put it in the 3rd edition. And then I wrote an article about this in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and then she answered me. You can look at our exchange because I'm rather pleased with it. But what I most like are the letters. Of course, most of them came from experts on ancient history who were furious about what you said about Romulus. I mean, it's just a detail. But what was interesting to me about this is that there are not only false statements, but false statements immune to correction. Now, in a typical, not all, but in many, many women's studies classes, you have sensitive young women, and they are given this data, and I've just given you a tiny, tiny set of examples. But on eating disorders, Naomi Wolf wrote in her book, The Beauty Myth, that every year 50,000 girls are dying of anorexia nervosa, a disease caused not by nature but by men. And I remember seeing that statistic and thinking, my God, I remember driver's ed when I was 15 and Mr. Fisk telling us 50,000 people die on the highways every year. And I thought, I don't think it's that many now, I hope, but back then, before seatbelts maybe. I thought, how can it be that more women are dying from anorexia nervosa than are dying in car accidents? We don't hear about it. Not that it's not a serious problem, but why exaggerate it? It turned out someone, not her, but Joan Jacob Brumberg, a women's studies scholar at Cornell, had misread a brochure that identified how many women were suffering from eating disorders. Suffering, not dying annually from anorexia. It got out there. It even got into Ann Landers eventually, but it was in the women's studies textbooks and the fact sheets. This propaganda is not without consequences. If you are a person with moral energy and good information, then I think you become a moral pioneer, a force for progress. But what if you're someone with all this moral energy and misinformation, a distorted view, and full of hate statistics? And in this case, against men, many of them, that men are the leading, men beating women up is the cause of birth defects, and anorexia. I think what happens is if you combine moral fervor with misinformation, you get zealotry. And I do think on some campuses, certainly not this one, I'm sure it's an exception, but on some campuses I have seen zealotry. And young women that are subject to this propaganda and become sort of hate intoxicated. And they tend to lose their sense of humor and transform. And I don't think this is good for women. I don't think it's good for feminism. I don't think it's good for anyone. But I do think gender feminism has a lot to answer for. They have allowed too much misinformation. Now, some people will say, well, okay, you found some mistakes. Feminism is a complex movement. There are thousands and thousands of books. There are bound to be some errors. What I and others have discovered are not a few errors. We have discovered a body of egregiously false information at the heart of, I would say, campus feminism, and to a lesser degree, but still in a very serious way, even the organized women's movement in Washington. I can see someone saying to me, okay, you've corrected some misapprehensions, and maybe the problems are not as extreme as have been described, but what about real problems? Can you deny that women earn only 76 cents for every dollar a man earns? That's not a false statistic. Or that, it tends to be men who are at the highest echelons of power in science and technology in corporate America. And how many female CEOs are there? Can you deny that women face serious, ongoing discrimination? Well, I don't deny that there are instances of discrimination, but let's look at the wage gap for a second. The 23-cent pay gap is simply the average difference between all men and all the women in the country working full-time. It doesn't account for differences in occupations, positions of education, what you majored in college, your job tenure, how many hours you work per week. When mainstream economists, including some good feminist economists, when they consider the wage gap, they find that the pay disparities are almost entirely the result of different life choices that men and women make, what they study in school. You will make more money if you major in economics than sociology. And far more men major in economics and far more women than men major in sociology. You will not earn the same if you get a PhD in philosophy or art history or anthropology. You might find it very interesting and rewarding, but much better off to go into petroleum engineering or computer technology or finance. But you have to make the controls. You can't compare someone with a PhD in philosophy with someone with a PhD in computer technology. Chances are the computer geek is making more money. You have to control for that. And there was a fantastic study on the wage gap in 2009 by the U.S. Department of Education, where they examined 50 peer-reviewed papers and concluded, quote, the wage gap may be almost entirely the result of individual choices being made both by male and female workers. Now, in addition to education and training, the review found that women were more likely than men to leave the workplace to take care of children. There were so many pay-related differences between the sexes that they were unable to specify even a residual effect that might be the result of discrimination. Now, wage gap activists at the American Association of University Women or the National Women's Law Center, they will sometimes, in their more honest moments, agree that women earn less not because of these predator employers cheating Jill out of her money and giving it to Jack. They will agree that it is women's choices, but then they ask the question, why do women make these choices? And by the way, just to give you one other example about female doctors, people say, look, even when you look at the same profession, male doctors earn more than females. That's a horrendous injustice. Until you notice that, this is a quote from the New York Times, they did a story about this. They said female doctors are more likely to be pediatricians than higher paying cardiologists. They are more likely to work part-time, and even those working full-time put in 7% fewer hours a week than men. They're also more likely to take extended leaves, and more often, usually because they have given birth and have a family. Now, there are exceptions, but most of the gaps in pay are narrow to the point of vanishing when you do the proper controls and compare oranges with oranges, and not apples and oranges. And as economists frequently remind us, if it were really true that in this country you could get away with paying women about 25% less than you pay a man, I mean, don't you think that every clever entrepreneur would just fire all his male employees and hire only women? And I mean, this law school, just get rid of all the male professors, hire only women, and they can reduce your tuition considerably, if this were true. Now, women's groups, and I know some of you are thinking this, well, but why do women go into pediatrics instead of cardiology? And we make a lot of other choices that are not good for us. Our education majors. Did anybody major in education? Oh, you're law students, you're too smart for that. I had two sons who majored in English. I begged them not to. I knew this would, they should be in economics or business, and you just want them to survive in the economy, but they didn't listen to me. But I will tell you, for both my sons, in many of their classes, it was them and, one boy and 25 girls. They didn't mind it at all, but, and my son, and he was at Vanderbilt, and his girlfriend was a computer science major, and her classes were mostly boys and her, and there they were together. But I'm not saying people don't defy the stereotype, but the most popular majors for men do lead to higher paying jobs, and for women, not as much. Now, why do we do that? The AAUW and the National Organization for Women, they say things like this: women's personal choices are fraught with inequities. They say women are pigeonholed into pink-collar jobs in health and education. According to the National Organization for Women, powerful sexist stereotypes steer women and men toward different education, training, and career paths. And family rules. Why do we take so much time out for kids? Now, my question is it really social conditioning and stereotypes that best explain women's vocational preferences and their special attachment to children? I mean, aren't most American women free and self-determining human beings? And here's what I think. I think the women's groups need to show, not dogmatically assert, they need to prove that women's choices aren't free, and the choices they make, by contrast, are authentic and undetermined and, by forces outside their control. That the choices they make for women are what women really want and what will make us happier and more fulfilled. And there's just an abundance of evidence that men and women don't want exactly the same thing. The Pew Research Center just recently asked married parents, fathers and mothers, what is your ideal working situation? And only about, 2/3 of women, these are mothers, most of them, in fact, I think these were all working mothers, 2/3 wanted to work part-time or not at all. And so only about 1/3 of working mothers want to be careerists. 1/3. 75% of the men wanted to be careerists. That's a big difference. Now, of course, you have that 1/3 of women, and I'm enough of an equity feminist to want to make sure the workplace is fair to them. But where's the women's movement that represents the women that want to work part-time and want to make that commitment, a stronger commitment to home? Or the women that want to be full-time homemakers? Where is a movement that represents their interests? And who's to say that they are captive to forces beyond their control and that's why they want to stay with their children? I think that's unsisterly, matronizing. And I think that we need to have more respect for the diversity of women and also the differences between the sexes. How much time do I have?
I think you're over.
Oh my God, I knew that would happen. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to go right to the end and say, I'm missing some good things, but just too bad. I think that this is what I'm calling for, a freedom feminism. I hope you all join. I'm no organizer, so It's not going to happen, but never mind. There is a need to correct 40 years of feminist advocacy research, to sort through it. Some of it's very good, but a lot of it is the opposite of good. And women who write about women's issues should not be expected to check their critical faculties at the door. And I think if you want good policies on violence against women, gender and education, workplace equity, it's got to be grounded on sound research. Number 2, we need a movement that is pro-woman, but not male-averse. And too many women's studies programs or women's groups, there's a philosophy you could call women are from Venus, men are from hell. And a reformed women's movement will realize that, as I said, we're partners. We're not, it's not a zero-sum competition between natural adversaries. We're like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Our fates are inextricably tied. If one is in trouble, so is the other. Finally, no political litmus tests. Freedom feminists can be liberal, conservative, or libertarian. They can differ on abortion or the wage gap or the role of government in the lives of women. But just think what we could do if we had a women's movement that could make common cause around something like misogyny in the popular culture or helping women in the developing world. You could bring so many Catholic women, traditionally Catholic or evangelical women. There are armies of women. We could have what they had in the 19th century, those two paths. And when you have those two paths, women prosper. I said I'd say something nice about Eve Ensler. I think that she's a little bit, well, I won't overstate it, but her Vagina Monologues is so male-averse and how do you call it, there's this word misogyny, hatred of women. She is a bit of a misandrist. But over the years, this woman has been actively fighting for women's rights in places like Rwanda and Afghanistan and Haiti. She's been working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where thousands of women were brutally raped and tortured by gangs of soldiers. And there was this frustrated UN official who was dismayed at the appalling, grotesque indifference of the world community. He just said, who's going to help us? Eve Ensler is helping. She's waging a campaign to raise world awareness. This is such a legitimate thing that she's doing. But if she were part of a movement that was inclusive, there would be so many more women there helping her. Okay. My final advice is to take back feminism. Reform it, correct its excesses, make it man-friendly, insist that moderate and conservative women be given a voice, and then set about the task of helping women across the globe write the next great chapter in the history of women's quest for freedom. So this part of the ovular is over. I will now take questions. Thank you.
I'm going to start with just a few questions and then leave you some time to ask questions of Christina Hoff Sommers. My question is that you say that the work here in this country is over for the feminists for the most part.
Yeah, the big battle. Now there are all kinds of little struggles.
But the little battles, as you call them, are the gender. There is still a wage gap between, even if you control for the factors that you talk about, there is still a wage gap.
Of about 6 cents, and we don't know if it's discrimination or something else we're not controlling.
And what about the fact that women are still underrepresented in many fields, including the law? The same number of women started at the law firm with me, but 5 years later, there were only 2 left of 10 that started, but all of the men that started were still there.
Right. Here's what I would say is that men and women are different. One thing about men is they tend to show up at the extremes of success and failure. You will find far more men who are CEOs of Fortune 500s and far more men who are in maximum security prisons. It's true across the world. Men succeed spectacularly and fail spectacularly. And there's no culture where you don't see this phenomenon. And they're probably connected. This wonderful libertarian feminist Camille Paglia once said, the reason there are so few female Mozarts is the same reason there's so few female Jack the Rippers. That there is men are known to be greater risk takers and more competitive and more kind of obsessive about one thing, and women are a little more balanced. So on average, you do find men at these extremes. So you will, in a law firm, careerists, you will find far more men who just want to focus on that. They don't mind staying 70 or 80 hours in the office. And you will find some women who, for sure, we're seeing them, fantastic workaholic women who are at the top of their field. There just aren't as many women that will do that as there are men. And a lot of men won't do it, but more the pool of men who are that way. So you will find men doing that. And the second reason is women are far more distracted than men are by children and by domesticity. And women you have a baby, and there's, for most people, you fall madly in love, and things change in your life, and men don't react that way. In fact, the big story about men right now isn't that they're becoming androgynous, helping, maybe some upper middle class men are doing that, but there's been a huge defection of men from the family altogether. That's the big story of the 21st century, is a big difference. So I think that when we have policies and we have attitudes, I think that we've got to be grounded on acknowledgement of who we are and what our differences are.
What do you say to your critics who say that a woman's choice to go into a certain lower paying career or to leave a law firm after 2 years is the result of conditioning and stereotypes and fear of sexual harassment and the glass ceiling and things like that?
It's interesting because theorists say that, but when you talk to women, why did you do that? Most of them just say that that was what they wanted to do. And then the question is, do you respect their autonomy? Now, I can think of societies where women don't have access to information or education, and they make self-defeating choices, and I would not call those free just because they made them. But in a society like ours, where we are the most informed people on the planet, over-informed perhaps, night and day, just bombarded with all kinds of information, then you have to respect the choice. I mean, I just think, I so understand why a woman that would just, when she sees the allure of home, fact is, today, most women don't want to be full-time mothers. About 20% do. And about 20% want to be full-time careerists. Most of us are what the economist Catherine Hakim calls adapters. We want to do both. And men do not have that at the moment. Maybe they'll change, but there's not a lot of evidence of that. And so I think the reason that the women aren't in the law firms and achieving partnership and so forth is because unless you can rid women of that special attachment to home and family, and I think that's probably changing human nature at a fairly deep level. I'm a little bit of an essentialist on certain issues, but not an absolutist. But I just think this is a fundamental difference, and I think we hurt women if we don't acknowledge that, and I think we have to respect their choices. Now, part of your question may be that, well, we're hurt by this. We're hurt if we don't have women 50% in the United States Congress. But I think what's important in a representative democracy is that you have a candidate who represents your interests. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of women, when I say, do you think someone like Sarah Palin or Michelle Bachmann represents your interests better than, say, Barack Obama? Or, I think what matters is you have someone there that speaks for you and whom you trust. And I don't think if it's a woman or a man, that's not what's critically important. So I think that as long as women are represented, and I would like to see more women, I'm hoping to, especially I'd like to see more sound conservative women getting into politics. I'm in favor of that, and I want to see it as an equity feminist. But I just don't believe in quotas. Here's what I believe in: equality of opportunity, but I don't expect, sameness of result. I think that you can have, that we have to protect equality of opportunity, but not insist on numerical parity. Yes. Oh, did you finish? No. Yes.
So I was just piggybacking a little bit on Beth's question. I was thinking about at what point would you say that women made it? Because I know when you're talking about your history, it seems like we kind of moved through suffrage and Mary Wollstonecraft, but then we kind of dropped off. Like we never talked about Mal or Betty Friedan or Gloria Steinem or Mary Daly or any of these people. And like when you're looking at any kind of movement or any kind of group of people that have been historically denigrated, like look at the people of color in this society. When civil rights happened, we wouldn't just say, that's it, we're good now. Because there's been this history of systematic, hierarchy. So I just wanted to know, at what point
college is, as many are now, 56 to 60% female. And women are getting 63% of the master's degrees, and they are now getting 52% of doctorate degrees. And you're at a college, let's say 60% women, and you still have a women's center because women are, you know, need support on that campus. I find that strange. I just find it strange. Women live, what is it, 6 or 7 years longer than men, have a better education, have and more choices. As I said, it's fixed. I don't say that there aren't problems, but I think that at a certain point, common sense and just basic, accommodation to reality. We have to be able to acknowledge success and move on. And there was a time, yes, and believe me, I would love to have talked about that whole era, and I have a chapter of that in my book, but I would have kept you here all night. You wouldn't have been happy with that. So I left out the 70s and the 80s, because we did have conservative women that were there in their very beginning. If you look at legislation, a lot of the pay equity laws and so on were passed before the feminist movement, the second wave in the early 60s, but that's another story. And as I said, I think we have to be aware and vigilant about protecting our hard-won freedoms, but on the other hand, we have to have grace in victory. And I don't see that grace in victory. I see some women, the better things seem to get for women, the angrier they get. And I also think that there's something I never saw in feminism in the early days, which is a kind of bigotry. And some women have kind of talked themselves into this antagonism to men. And that's not true of most feminists, but there are a core who kind of exhibit the very qualities that made me a feminist. I became a feminist in the 70s because I did not appreciate male chauvinism. I still do not. Today, I believe we have a problem with female chauvinism. And so those to me are signs that we need to reboot. We need to adjust. And then finally, if I would say another problem with the movement, it's not attracting a majority of women. It appeals to a small coterie of mostly, I don't say like-minded because they have a lot of doctrinal feuds among themselves if you go to these women's studies conferences. But it seems to me that the movement is running out of steam and not changing with the times. That's what I'm calling for. Yes?
I find this kind of interesting because I come from a place where women, so I went to Wellesley. So of course we had like our little subsection of, angry feminists, but for the most part I found we're a place where women just supported each other, and it wasn't any kind of us versus them dynamic, and it was just people helping other people. And do you ever think that maybe this movement would be more successful if we just abandoned the idea of feminism at all and just as people helped each other without considering the gender binary in any way?
Well, I've asked that a lot, and I would probably, someone said to me, we shouldn't be feminists, we should be equalists, or we should be humanists. And I sort of agree with that, except for the fact that there's so many women in the world who really are struggling with age-old patriarchy and need our help. And I do see some genuine misogyny in this culture that needs to be attended to. Right now, we're kind of helpless before all the things that go on in the popular culture. And I'm kind of libertarian, so I'm not eager to censor it. But on the other hand, I think it's harmful. I think it's even dangerous. So there's still work to be done. So that's for those reasons but I sympathize with that. And I do think we should include men. And it should be a very kind of generous, inclusive, capacious movement. The way that people are environmentalists, they should be feminists. It just should be something you are because you're an enlightened person. It's not that way today. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to touch just briefly because I've taught Nancy Lemon, and I thought, well, when you're talking about rule of thumb, I think the point that she was making with regard to Romulus was that violence against women goes back as far as you can go. When she spoke of the rule of thumb, however, she was relating it to British common law. And it is in British common law, so it wasn't something, no. I'm going to tell you I researched it. So
I know that's the thing.
We can debate it.
I know we
I'll
can't.
move on, because I really do disagree with you on that point. And also, idea that people are out on the fringe with their statistics and and information about domestic violence, you can look to the Bureau of Justice, Labor Statistics. You can look to the Department of Justice statistics on violence against women, and those are very troubling statistics that we have to deal with. We can't skim over. We can't overlook them. We can't say they're over there and they're irrational. They are part of what women are dealing with in this society. That doesn't mean we go off and stand in our corner and say, men, you're over there, and women, you're over here. It's our problem. It's all of our problem, but we are at fault if we overlook it and skim over it and say it's not a problem. With regard to women who are saying they'd like to stay at home, women don't have the choice. Maybe some of the women you know have the choice, but there are a lot of women out there who don't have that choice. They have to support their families, and when they're doing that and they're getting paid less than men, that's a problem we all have because they're raising our children. So I don't think it's fair for you to just say, well, we're beyond all of this. We have problems in this country. I'm very happy to hear you say that we should be looking and helping throughout the world, but we have some work to do here still. We're not through the door, but we should be conscious and glad about what we've achieved. But there's a lot more to do, and I think you should credit the people who are still saying that there's work to be done, even if you disagree with how they might be saying it.
Fair enough, just a couple of points. All I ask you to do is, I mean, it might be tedious to do this, but since you're interested, you might do it, is just go to the Chronicle of Higher Education and read what I wrote, and then read what her answer and my reply, and then the scholars. And there are a lot of feminist scholars who, the thing about the rule of thumb is that there is a literature, and you can get caught up in it. It isn't a subtle bit of misinformation. It's embedded in so much literature that you can spend your, that's what I'm saying. My friends say, stop talking about the rule of thumb, forget it, move on, and I will. But it is interesting because it's just not true. But yet a lot of very smart people think it's true. Nancy Lemon thinks it's true. But just read that exchange and then tell me what you think, and we'll see.
But I don't want that to distract us from the point, which is that domestic violence going back in time has been a problem, still is a problem, something we shouldn't skip over, and that it's something we should be careful about, thinking about how we're going to deal with, and its implications for women in the society.
I absolutely agree, and that's why I think that is a cause that conservative women and liberal women could come together, and I think we need good researchers to find out what's really going on, because I have found a lot of hyped up statistics. I want good, solid statistics, and then I think instead of it just being a problem that only like a small coterie of feminists are dealing with, it should be opened up. You could have so many women sign on to that cause. But it's become highly politicized, and a lot of women are just not part of it.
Beyond being politicized, really. I think a lot of people are caught up in dealing with it. I think it's something that's been recognized throughout society. It's not a fringe issue. It's not a feminist issue in the way you've described feminism. I think it's a community issue that the community is responding to and involved with. It's not a fringe, and it's not recognized throughout the society.
But we're still not solving the problem.
We're trying to, though. And I think we should do more.
I do too. I don't think we disagree there.
Okay.
And about the mothers, here's what I have to say about the stay-at-home mothers and the mothers. If you care about what women say they want, and this isn't just in America, this is in Sweden, this is in Iceland, this is in these Scandinavian countries who are like gender utopias compared to most places in the world, women still evince a stronger tendency towards the private sphere. If you ask them, they'd say they want to work part-time. I don't see a women's movement, and you'll say, oh, well, the economy and so forth. That's true, but it seems to me the women's movement is dedicated to kind of careerism, and they do a very good job helping that 20% that want their careers. But again, if we could get together, we might be able to think of policies, we might think of changes in the workplace that would make it possible for women to do what they want. I don't see those policies that are supportive of stay-at-home mothers or women that want to work part-time. And I think there are some institutes that are looking into it, but it's not a mainstream movement. And I think for the younger generation, it's going to be a huge problem, and we need smart solutions. But I don't think they could just come, as I said, from one path. I think that we need conservative women and liberal women and men addressing them and figuring out how we can change American society to meet the preferences of women. A lot of women want to be in the home, and they can't. You're absolutely right, they can't. But what if we can find ways to make it more possible? What if we were able to encourage businesses to adopt policies that allowed for what was called the mommy track? And a lot of women's advocates were horrified that we would even speak of such a thing. But you know, a lot of us would like to be on that track, which means that you're going to kind of divide work at home, and they wanted businesses to carve out a place. I'm not saying that's the solution. I don't know the solution to half these problems. They're insoluble. Maybe it should be life. But right now, I don't see enough activism around. Actually, Catherine Hakim, who did these studies of Swedish women and Danish women and so on, she calls it preference feminism. She wants a feminism that'll just try to satisfy what people want. Yes?
I want to say I do agree with you on saying that feminism has lost its organization. I do agree. I think it's just kind of all over the place. However, I'm wondering where you're hearing that it's not moving with the times. Because I recently graduated with a women's and gender studies degree. And first of all, we were very male inclusive. More actually, I think, than we should have been, personally, for myself. We were wary when a male went into the classroom because we didn't quite know how to relate or whatever, in just different ways, but we were never unwelcoming to men. And that was part of the reason why it's being changed to women and gender studies, more than just women's studies all over the country. We were studying third wave, even what's coming up on the considered fourth wave, which does not exist yet, of feminism, and where that was going to go and how we could move with the times. We were constantly focused on how we could move with the times, what's going on in our present culture, looking back at history and seeing what we could take and what we should leave. So I'm just wondering where you're hearing that it's not moving with the times.
It's always, I don't want to, I hope I was careful to say that there are exceptions, and there are some great programs and some women's studies scholars that have become dear friends. Because I had a lot of fights when I wrote Who Stole Feminism, but I'm making friends again. But Christine Rosen is a historian who did a content analysis of the 5 leading women's studies textbooks, and she did not find intellectual diversity. For example, more conservative positions on women were not treated respectfully, and were caricatured, and it tend to privilege a kind of left-wing analysis of society. And so I think we could benefit from not taking the left-wing politics out of it, because as a philosophy professor, whenever I taught a course, I thought it was a sacred commandment, thou shalt teach both sides of the argument. So I'd love to hear from the radicals, the more colorful the better, but then it has to be balanced by, and I'm not talking about social policy issues. If I was teaching metaphysics or proofs for the existence of God, I just thought I had to give the students the best that was thought and said on both sides. And I have not seen that in women's studies. There's not evidence of it in the textbooks, but if that happened in your school, that's a good sign, and I welcome it. Yes?
What can men do to advance equality feminism?
Make less money.
If they make, well, never mind. That it doesn't help women if men make less money. And the sad thing is that one reason the wage gap has been closing a little bit is because, especially working class men are making less money. There's been a devastation for working class men. Most of the jobs lost in the last recession were men. Some people call it the man session. And it's horrible. And boys who are not, some whom you may have known in high school, who were not they were school phobic. Their fate in our society, it's terrible. And so I think that what men can do right now, it's difficult because if a man speaks out and is maybe critical, a lot of women immediately think that you're being hostile, and men tell me, well, you can say these things because you're a woman, but if I said, professors say I could never say those things. And so we have kind of a lot of self-censorship. However, it's changing with younger men. And I think the reason is that there are a lot of women and men in their 60s or older who really did confront a lot of sexism and misogyny, and the women are bitter, and the men are embarrassed. Younger generation had a different experience. Younger women maybe grew up, they were the haves in the classroom. They were getting the better grades and winning the awards. I think there's a new psychology, and so I think that I'm beginning to see some fantastic research coming from young economists, male and female, psychologists, and I love it. It's keeping me busy because I keep writing articles. I just wrote something in Slate. I hope it's there tonight, but about a new study about men doing housework. And these are the economists or sociologists. They analyzed this huge data sample we had from the 90s about men in the home, and they had data that showed that people kept track of what they did in the home. They had a huge sample of several 100,000 people, and how often married couples, what they did all day and how often they had sex. And what they found was that in homes where the men did the women's chores, there was the least sex. And where men did like the manly chores and the woman did the female chores, there was the most. Then they thought, well, maybe the men are coercive in these families. But then they found that egalitarian marriages and these traditional marriages had, the ones they studied, had the same level of happiness, except that the traditionalists were having considerably more sex. And then they tried to control for age and income and working, and they just said that there was this very robust connection. And they hypothesized that in a marriage there's something more going on than simply sharing the life together. There's a kind of fantasy life, and that it may be that there's a female, and they studied heterosexual marriage. It might be different in gay marriages, although it may replicate itself in some way there as well. But what they found is there was this polarity, and it kind of kept alive attraction. And they haven't entirely figured it out, but I have it, if you go to Slate, I have an article about it. And this article, I don't think anyone would have written an article like this 10 or 15 years ago. These are just younger scholars and who wrote something that's kind of politically incorrect, and, because, who was it? Sheryl Sandberg was on 60 Minutes. She's the author of Lean In, and she said on 60 Minutes, the sexiest thing a man can do is the dishes. Nothing turns a woman on more. And she said there's this book called Porn for Women, and it's all pictures of men vacuuming and cleaning the kitty litter, and women get really hot when they see that. And so I heard that, and I just thought, it doesn't seem true. I mean, it's gratifying when a man does the laundry, but it's not exactly that exciting. I wondered. So I tried to find, and I found that these scholars, so I'm carrying on too long, but it's just an example of, I think, some kind of, what you would call it, edgy scholarship that's coming. So I think if you become a lawyer, a scholar, or a researcher, just start doing honest research.
Yes, time for one more question. Oh.
Did you want to? Okay. Actually, my question is, one of the things that I'm frustrated the most by this new feminism is this complete refusal to acknowledge that we are biologically different. And I'm wondering, you've mentioned it and kind of glossed over it a couple times, but I'm wondering what you think the benefits would be of just embracing the fact that we are biologically different. We have, different physiology, we have different hormones, we have different, all of those things. How could we benefit by embracing that?
Oh, in so many ways. But first with a warning. Most people embody the stereotypes of their sex to one degree or another. There's manliness and femininity. You see it everywhere. You see it in the magazines we read. You see it in our pastime and so forth. And another study that I love that came out recently, these researchers looked at gender differences across the world. They studied 55 countries, and they found the wealthier and more prosperous the country, the more pronounced the sex difference. And their theory was that personalities are sort of more constrained in poor societies. Men and women are more alike than couples, say, in Denmark or New York City. And it turns out that sex difference, gender difference, could be a phenomenon of freedom. And they hypothesize that there's more self-actualization. And so I think if we could think that way and realize that embracing your femininity, I'm a proponent of gay liberation. And it's no accident that also thrives in a free and prosperous society. For the most part, that's where these movements have arisen, where people will insist on being able to be who they are. But I think we have to accord that to heterosexuals. And there are a lot of very feminine women and masculine men, and we should be as tolerant of that as I hope we are becoming about homosexuality. And so I do think there are differences. Now, the one warning is there are always women and men who defy the stereotypes. So if I say more women are likely to major in English than electrical engineering, there are always going to be these brilliant women who are electrical engineers. So you have to be aware that when you're just giving averages, just statistical averages, that says nothing. It's not an absolute. And it just means that on average, this is how people are. And where I agree with you is on average, men and women are different. And certainly with respect to how we spend our time, how we divide our home and work life, we have differences. And I think that we need a women's movement that can make a place for that, because then I think that it would be, first of all, I think it would help women, especially those who want to be more traditionally feminine. The reason we had the women's movement is that it was horrible when all the women were forced into this stultifying conformity. So you wanted to open the door and let women out who wanted to be different. But there were a lot of us who just didn't mind being conventional, so you have to allow for that. And the last thing I'll say is that I can't remember the last thing I was going to say. Suddenly left past my mind. I'm talking too much. So how would it help? Oh, okay, the last thing I will say. Here's the big, it should be of interest to all of you. I think that there's, I don't want to overstate it, but I think that some of the teachings of hardline feminism have been poisonous for relations between men and women. And there's a lot of misunderstanding and hostility. And I think that if we had a more humane and reality-based women's movement, it could repair some of that damage. I don't think we want a society. We suffered with a society divided along the lines of race, and we're mending that. It hasn't finished, but it's a huge undertaking. But we don't want to deliberately divide ourselves along the lines of gender, and we don't need to do that. So that's what I'm calling for, is a kind of inclusive feminism with goodwill towards men. Thank you.